we need to style the other initial components. So who did it? Yeah, excitement. Very nice. Bonus credit, make the form work. Who was able to make the form work? I wasn't real specific about how it should work, but that's okay. Do it however you want. Make a working delete button. Anybody pull that off? Hey, you tried. It counts. Anybody make it so that when you click on the note in the list, it populates the form with the data from that note? Nice. Cool. Talk about all the ways we can do that stuff. First, there was a little something that we didn't quite get through in the morning that we did in the afternoon. I put it in Slack later, but hopefully you saw the pattern. In the sidebar component, we had this Quill SVG that we imported, and then we're able to use just as a JavaScript object here. We still have these other two ping images that we're loading from Amazon S3, even though we have the files right here in public. New hover ping and new ping. We do the same thing with them that we did with Quill. I'm just going to drag them to source. Import them. Import new hover. Can't put a hyphen in the name here, right? It's a JavaScript variable. New hover ping. Import new. Well, we can't just call this one new either, right? Because that's a keyword, reserved word. New icon will do from new.ping. And then these images, we could replace the URL for new hover with new hover. Replace this one with new icon. And we don't expect to see any difference when we look in the browser. It should look exactly like it did before. And this hover effect should still work. So interesting note about how we achieved this effect here. We have two different images right next to each other here, right? New hover is the one with the blue circle filled in and the white plus. New is this one. So what we're doing is in the style sheet for sidebar, here's the rule for an image that is a descendant of button, that is a descendant of something with a class of sidebar. That ends right here. So I position it, I say where it's going to be, I set the width to 100% of its container, which is why the images like the SVG was no longer enormous, because now it'll only fill its container. And then we have this transition here. Opacity, 0.25 seconds. So we've done like transition 0.25 seconds before, but now we're saying only opacity does this affect. And then ease in out. I forget what they call that piece of the rule. Transition, what's that called? CSS transition. Transition property, transition duration, transition timing function. So transition timing function, you can actually make up your own way that this should work. But what it tells you is like, should it just go evenly over the 0.25 seconds, or should it like start out changing very gradually and then sort of speed up at the end? And what we've put in here is ease in out, which means it sort of starts out slow, then starts going faster, then slows down again before it stops. So it's not just spread out evenly, like if you were to split it into keyframes, each frame of the animation, it doesn't just spread them out equally over the 0.25 seconds. It does this little ease in out thing, which is pretty dang subtle, especially at just a quarter of a second, but it does make a difference. It's kind of an interesting thing to explore. So then what we do is we add a rule for the hover effect, And it's not just when you hover over the image, it's when you hover over the whole button. So an image with a class of outline, which outline is the default one, not the hover state. That is a descendant of a hovered button in the sidebar. We set the opacity to 0. So in other words, the image we're seeing now becomes transparent when we hover over it. But it becomes transparent gradually because we have this transition on opacity. So then you see the image that's underneath it. So the other image is there the whole time. It's just this is covering it up. Now, ordinarily, if you stick two things next to each other right there, they're going to be side by side or something, right? Not one on top of the other. That's what this position absolute is about. Positioning is another way of doing layout that you should only use when you need to. There are often better ways, but that's exactly what we need for something like this. And the button itself, we also have position relative with no top or left or right or bottom value, simply because position absolute positions things relative to the closest ancestor that is itself positioned. So it'll be relative to the entire page unless somewhere up its ancestor chain something else has a position of relative or absolute. So I just throw position relative on here. That way, this will be relative to the button. I don't want it to be relative to the page because I want it to be centered inside this sidebar, left and right. And I don't know how many pixels over that's going to be. So if I just make sure that the button is in the right place, then I can just make sure I position the image right at the beginning of the button, and I get the effect I want. A little complicated, but we didn't quite get to talk about that yesterday, so I wanted to do that real fast. I'll go ahead and commit that. Import images in our JS. Does it seem a little weird to import images into JavaScript? It does to me, but this is part of the build process that we have using Create React App. It makes stuff like this possible. So if we were to look at like the sources for this page, we're not going to see, well, we do because we have what are called source maps, but we won't see a network fetch for those images or anything like that because it's all been kind of smashed in together with our JavaScript. It's kind of interesting.